Hi, I'm Joan McDonald. I've been writing about Korean media for a few years, and for the last 2 years, I've written about Korean film, TV, music, and more as a contributor for Forbes.com. And during that time, my appreciation of Korean cinema has only grown, and I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of creative people in the industry. Thanks to the Asia Society, I have this wonderful opportunity of being here today and having a conversation with director He Jin-ho about his wonderful historical film, Forbidden Dream. Pleasure to meet you, Director
네, 저도 반갑습니다.
He.
I'm very happy to meet you too.
Okay. The first question I'm going to ask you is about the challenges involved in making a historical film. Forbidden Dream, and also the film that you made before that, The Last Princess, focus on actual historical figures. And I know sometimes there's controversy when people feel that you play with history or you don't portray it the way they see it. As a director, what challenges do you face when you're making a film about a historical figure? What can you change? What can you reinterpret?
처음에 역사 영화를 만들 때
When I first made a film about something that actually happened in history, obviously I spent a lot of time thinking about how I'm going to portray what actually happened as to how I'm going to interpret it, because I really enjoyed Braveheart. But then I found out later that it was not historically correct at all or accurate at all. So when you dramatize something and put it on the screen, then you have to think about standards or guidelines. But ultimately, when we're dealing with history, there are things that we can't know for sure exactly what happened, what language did they use, and also the costumes. We spend a lot of time researching what they actually look like. But from the perspective of someone who's creating something, there are many difficulties. But in a way, a sense of imagination in a cinematic sense and how to persuade or convince the audience, you think about that when you're dealing with a historical figure. So I think there was a conscious from the viewpoint of the filmmaker. And so for these two films, I was criticized for distorting some historical facts, and yes, that is very difficult.
Okay. King Sejong, who is a central character in your film, is one of the most popular historical figures to appear on Korean TV and in films. In Forbidden Dream, you portray him as someone who is more concerned with a person's merit or talent than his origins or his station in life. For people who may not be very familiar with that period of Korean history, can you explain a little why it is so controversial for him to raise Jang Yong-sil up or to be friends with him? What is the context?
소세기는 굉장히 신분 제도라는 것이.
So in the 15th century, there was a social status or social rank system, kind of like the caste system. So for a slave becoming a government official, that was nearly impossible. And at the time, the philosophy that King Sejong had in politics, as you mentioned, I think one of the main reasons he's highly revered until now is that he loved the people. And so for him, people were the most important. And that's why he drafted the Korean alphabet and also all the scientific equipment that was missioned. And then at the time, agriculture was the central industry. So for the general people, having scientific knowledge to apply to agriculture made their lives more, it enriched their lives. So I think for King Sejong, people were the most important. And Chang Yong-sil went from a slave to what's considered nowadays as a vice minister. So if we check the historic records, King Sejong for example, if a female slave got pregnant, the male slave connected to that, or the partner of that female slave, also got kind of like a break or vacation. So that tells us how much he respected people, and that's why he's highly respected.
Okay. Before these last two films, which were both historical films, you were perhaps best known for films that portray romantic love. I believe a writer said that you were the very best director at portraying the beginnings and endings of love. Now, in The Last Princess and in Forbidden Dream, there's not so much romantic love. I mean, there's love of country, there's love of science, there's love through friendship. Are you done with romantic love, or are you exploring love on a wider context?
글쎄요, 제가 이제 로맨스 영화는 재밌어요. 재밌는 이유가
romantic stories are fun for me. They're very interesting, and it's a part of our daily lives. And when you do a romance film, it's a great tool to use, or material to use, to express all the emotions that we experience. So melodramas or romance movies, romantic movies, I've enjoyed making them, but the industry itself and the circumstances for filmmaking have changed greatly. So love stories you see a lot on TV, and people don't go to the theaters as much for a love story. And so I adapted kind of. And I was thinking, maybe I'll try doing something with history. And so I did Dangerous Liaisons in China. And I went on to do big movies or bigger movies that deal with a certain historical era. I always have the desire to make romance movies if given the opportunity.
I hope you get that opportunity. My next question is going to be about how you became a director. You studied philosophy in college. You have a degree in philosophy. How did that lead to making films? Did you see films as a way to ask important questions and maybe answer them? I mean, what was the trajectory from philosophy to filmmaking?
글쎄요,
Well, let me see. I did major in philosophy, but I didn't really study it that hard. I thought of becoming a film director at a later age. So I'd already graduated from college, and I worked for a large corporation for a year and a half. And I was thinking, I want to create something. And I was very fortunate to be given an opportunity. There's a school called the Korean Academy of Film Arts. Bong Joon-ho is also a graduate. And at the time, I had a full-time job and I was studying English a little bit. I was studying filmmaking a little bit. And that year, there was a trend that Korean movies need to go international. And because I'd been studying English, that helped me pass the entrance exam to get into the Korean Academy of Film Arts. So I had an advantage. And so the pros of having studied philosophy, well, some things I can remember is what Socrates did, where you ask the opposite of what you want. And then in philosophy, I was thinking, what do I want to do? So there were some things that I could actually apply on set when I was working as a film director. So rather than telling the actors, this is right, this is what I want you to do, I would ask them for their opinions and then we would seek out the answers together. Because I majored in philosophy, I think it has something to do with my filmmaking.
Another question about directing. Directing films seems to me anyway to be a very complex undertaking, from the first pages of a script you read to this kind of promotion you're doing now. What part of the whole process do you really love the most? At what point in making a film do you say, this is why I became a director, this is what I love? Or do you love the whole process, or some of the process some of the time?
이제 덕혜옹주를 만들었을 때,
when I was working on The Last Princess, it was received very well, so I was very happy. Internationally, when I'm working on a film, creating a film, starting from writing the script and then being on set and then editing and also checking the results at the box office, there is tremendous stress, so it is by no means an easy task. And I was thinking, after making a film and I was taking a break, while I was shooting, I just wanted to take a break. I thought that a lot, and I thought I'd be so happy if I'm taking a break. But when I was on the break, after I was done with the film, I realized, oh, I was the happiest when I was working on the film. So I think being on set or working on a film is basically the reason I live.
Good answer. But that leads me to my next question, which is, I know sometimes creative people will be working on one project, but in their mind, they're already working on another project. Do you get inspired by ideas while you're working on a project, or do you need time between the projects to become inspired? I mean, you've got an impressive resume of work. You've turned out projects almost consistently since your debut. But I know that the dates on such a list don't necessarily have to do with when you came up with the idea. So, am I clear? Yeah? And actually, in a larger sense, what inspires you?
네. 그 어떤 만약에 영감을 얻는다는 거는 창작자
If I were to talk about inspiration for a creator, it's a second, it's a moment, and you get it's not a moment or a second that inspires you to do something. I think these things pile up over time, and there comes a point where it makes sense and it becomes a story.
Mhm.
So when I'm working on something, I'm working on a TV series right now.
모든 어떤 신경들이 그 작품으로 이렇게 연결돼 있는 것 같아요. 그래서
I think everything is connected to what I'm working on at the moment. So thinking of something else is very difficult. I mean, of course, I could
뭐 제의받은 작품이나 혹은 제가 생각하는 다른
possibly think about another project that's been proposed to me. I could think about writing something about it.
어떤 작품을 만드는 과정에서 보면은 창작자들이
But in the process of working on something, because creators are so absorbed, so focused on that, it's kind of like when you're dating somebody and you're serious. So I'm in love with somebody, then of course I'm not going to be looking around at other people. It's kind of like that. So for me, it's usually after I'm done with something.
Okay. You mentioned you are working on a TV drama, which I believe in English is called Disqualified as a Human. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you've never done a TV drama before, have you? Why did you decide to do a TV drama instead of another film? And can you tell me something about this project? Because I want to be sure I see it.
저도 제가 TV 드라마를 하게 될지는 몰랐어요.
I had no idea that I would be working on a TV drama. But in the case of Disqualified as a Human, which is a TV series, you don't get the full script. What I'm making is going to be a 16 episodes.
해보고 싶다는 생각이 들었고.
So I just got a couple of episodes first, and then I was thinking, oh, I want to work on this.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a novel in Japan of the same title, but the contents are completely different, although it does have some similarities in tone and manner. So I'm working with Chun Do-yeon and Yoo Chun-yeol, who are the main characters, who are playing the main characters. And we've already been shooting this. And the story is about people who are hurt, and it's the process of how they heal. I think it'll start airing in September or October, and because we have OTT, it's going to be broadcast around the world at the same time.
Okay. And what is the genre of this drama?
멜로이기도 하고.
It's a melodrama and it's not just a story about these two main characters. There are several characters and whose lives that we get a glimpse into. It's about ordinary people, but for them, they also have these huge emotional scars. So it's a story about everyone healing.
Okay. Who inspires you? Which filmmakers inspire you? And what have you seen lately that you thought was really great?
글쎄요, 제가 그 학생이었을 때
when I was a student, I loved Wim Wenders from Germany. So I watched a lot of his films. and then Oji as Hiro from Japan.
Mhm.
I also loved his films, and I was influenced a lot. And recently, I haven't been able to watch a lot of movies because of the TV series I'm working on.
Mhm.
I couldn't watch them in a movie theater.
Right. Yeah.
But I did watch a remake of Joje.
Mhm. Oh, yes. Yes. I saw that. I like that.
Of Jose, the Tiger and the Fish.
Mhm. Yeah.
So you've watched
yes.
everything.
Okay. I've just got one more question. As a director, what effect do you think it has had when Parasite won the Oscar last year? What effect has it had in terms of gaining respect for the Korean cinema? And also with Yoon Jung winning multiple nominations and awards for her supporting role in Minari, how do you think this will improve the visibility of Korean talent?
그러니까요. 제가 이제 처음 작품을 만들었을 때는
When I was first working on a film, when I was debuting, there was no Korean wave.
Mhm.
So my first film allowed me to go to various international film festivals and to Japan and China. And what I felt then was that Korean films couldn't be mainstream.
Mhm.
Because films have cultural power or influence or strength. So compared to other films from more powerful countries, I felt Korean films could not make it. And that has changed drastically over the last 20 years or so. And we have films like Parasite, which received a huge award, and it's garnered a lot of attention. So the universal elements of a film have nothing to do, regardless of cultural power or the how powerful a nation is, it doesn't reflect that. So for a creator, it makes it possible for me and other filmmakers to dream big or bigger. So it has a positive influence.
I think so too. That was it for my questions, but I see we're getting some questions from the audience. This question says that, hello, he would like to ask you if there are special ways or habits that you use to become inspired. And he's also curious if there are specific subjects you would like to deal with later.
글쎄요, 영감을 얻기 위한 특별한 방법이나
I
습관은
don't really have any special methods or habits to get inspired. I don't think true inspiration comes that way. It's not something that you get by trying to get it. Sometimes it just passes by like a fleeting idea. I think it's important to get into the habit of taking notes or writing down things, and also trying to get closer to people who are different from me, who are leading different lives. And I think that gives you something new to think about. And so I should be making those kind of efforts, but as I get older, it's not easy to meet new people. But to try and get inspired, or making an effort to get inspired, is not that easy, and something that I would possibly want to do in the future. Maybe do another romance film.
Good. Okay, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for talking to me. I'm going to turn you over to Charles Coker, who's going to deal with the question and answers from the audience. The questions from the audience, your answers. Okay, thanks a lot. Here's Charles.
Director Her, thank you so much. And Joan, thank you for your insightful and in-depth questions. So, Director Her, I guess a couple of other questions that have come from the audience, and questions that I think I have an interest in hearing an answer to are, is there talent that you are interested in working with? For example, are there actors or actresses or writers or other people, either in Korea or internationally, that you have an interest in working with on future projects? Do any people come to mind?
근데 이제 그냥 특별하게 지금 막 생각이 안 나는데.
Nobody comes to mind at the moment.
Okay, well, we'll let you think about it. So there's been a question from the audience with respect to, what is the
제가 지금 얘기를 특별하게 생각하는 배우를.
Well, I'm not. If I were to mention someone's name, an actor's name, and then I ask them to work with me, then it could get sticky later. Rather than decide on an actor, I like actors who choose me. I think that's my strategy now. That was my strategy until now.
Understood. So, in Hollywood, there's after, with the advent of films like Snowpiercer and Parasite and other films like this, there's really been a great impact of Korean film in Hollywood and in the international field. So, and I think there's a great interest in Hollywood to work with Korean directors, and not only on Korean projects, like Netflix has made a big commitment to making Korean projects and Korean language projects, but also, projects with Korean directors for international projects. Could you ever see yourself doing something like that? Does that hold interest to you?
글쎄요. 저도 이제 제가 해외에서 작업한 작품이 2작품이 있었는데.
Let me see. I've worked on 2 films abroad and in China. And what I felt in the process was that language or culture and the differences in those fields, in those aspects, were not a huge obstacle in filmmaking. When I was working on A Good Rain Knows, I was working with Gao Yuan and also Cecilia Chung. So when I was talking about how to act, or when I was directing, before the translator translated what I was saying, the actors were able to sense what I was trying to say. And when the actors were saying something to me, I could understand what they were trying to say before I got the translation. So in filmmaking, language and culture are not an issue. So of course there are some difficulties, but if it's a good story and if it's a good project, then I would love to work on something internationally. I think all directors feel the same way.
So following up on that, I mean, having myself worked in China on films, was there a significant difference in the way films were made in China, your experience in China, than, for example, your experience in making films in Korea?
가장 큰 차이는 중국은
The
정말
biggest difference is that for China, there's a huge crew
한국에서 영화를 찍을
compared to filmmaking in Korea. I would say twice or three times as many people were working on it on set. There was one person whose job was to just pick up the cigarette butts. There was another guy that would set up all the chairs for the directors and the cast, and everything was very systematic.
그것이 아마 가장 큰 차이였다.
I think that was the biggest difference.
But from on a creative standpoint, working with as you said, working with the actors and working with the other creative talent on the shoot, it was just very much similar. I mean, there really wasn't a cultural difference then.
그러니까 그것이 이제 그 시간적으로
I think
통역이라는
time-wise, because we had to have a translator.
처음 영화를 찍을 때 시작 부분에 있어서는 힘들었지만은
So in the beginning, that was a bit difficult to get adjusted to. But we did get used to it, and as time passed, the delays got shorter and shorter.
제가 이제 제 경험에 있어서는 창작에는
And from my experience, I felt that doing something creative, there wasn't a big difference.
Wonderful. So we have a couple of more questions from the audience. One was has to do with the movie that we're speaking about, Forbidden Dream, and they wanted to ask how close is the ending of the film to the established history, because there seems to be some mystery about the kind of what happened, in those characters.
그 장영실에 대한 기록은
The records about Chang Yong-sil, if you look in the records for King Sejong, he received 80 strikes and then he disappeared from history. And that part, there are no more records about this person. So whether he died after the flogging or what happened afterwards, nobody knows. The last scene in Forbidden Dream, was of course more cinematic. And so the creativity, the imagination is there. It's based on the history, but it did end on a cinematic note.
Yes. So another question from the audience is, and this, I'm sure this is a very difficult question to answer for any director, considering that all the directors' creations are their favorites. But an audience member is asking, what is the most meaningful work that you have done to date, or is that still to come?
대부분의 영화 감독들이
Most filmmakers
만든 영화를 보는 일은 거의 없어요.
don't really watch their own films.
어떤 영화를 가장 좋아하는지가
So to think about what they like the most, I wouldn't say they do that even now.
어떤 기회에 다시 보게 됐을 경우에는
So if I had the opportunity to watch one of my films again,
뭐랄까 하자들만 보이는
let me see, you only see the flaws. Like Christmas in August, which was my debut film, I was able to watch it and people liked it a lot, so I thought it would be great and I watched it. And I could just see all the problems. So in that sense, it's difficult for a director to like their own work.
Of course, it's not, an artistic vision is always perfect, but the realization of that artistic vision is always full of practicality. So I can completely understand your sentiment. But as a fan of your films, I can say that those were all beautiful films, and I know the public is very grateful that you released all of those and that gave us the opportunity to see your vision.
감사합니다.
Thank you.
So, one thing, having been very familiar with the Hollywood process of filmmaking and how development works and how the whole process goes through, and China is a very different kind of universe. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about your process and how that kind of fits into the Korean School of Filmmaking, since, you really came to filmmaking a little bit, wasn't your first career. And, but, what is your process? Do you want to have an absolutely buttoned up script at the beginning before you start shooting? Are lots of changes made as you go through the process? I mean, maybe you could give us some insight into, to your creative vision and your creative process when you are making a film.
그런 그 영화의 규모에 따라서 또 달라지는 점도 있는 것 같아요. 제가 이전에 작업했던 작품
Sometimes it depends on the size of the movie, the scale of the movie.
영화를 만드는 방식이 감독이 굉장히
So, in making a film, a Korean director has to make a lot of decisions. And those decisions, many of them were very important. That was before. And then recently, filmmaking has become completely industrialized. And now the decisions are not all up to the director. It depends on the investor or the production company. And so there are a lot of opinions to be taken into account, and a lot of it goes according to plan. So it's getting more and more like the Hollywood system. It's been quite a while since I made a film in China. So their way of filmmaking is more like the Korean way before, when I was making my early films. In the case of Dangerous Liaisons in China, it had a large budget, but still the director had to make a lot of decisions.
So I can understand how, as the film industry becomes more and more internationalized, I think things are becoming more standardized as far as the process of filmmaking, and I can understand your viewpoints on that. So another question from the audience. Every artist has this challenge about, how do we take, how do we let criticism affect us? And the audience member has asked, do criticism or critiques from your fans or from the audience, is this something you internalize? Is this something that you think about, this is something I could do different on my next film? Or really is just filmmaking just kind of the realization of your own vision?
이제 저도 데뷔한 지가 한 20년 넘었고 작품 수도 한 7, 8작품 되는데 그
I've worked on 7 or 8 films, and that there were good reviews and bad reviews. So whenever possible, I tried not to read them, but I did end up reading some. So in the process, a good thing for a director to do is to focus more on the next project rather than what people are saying about the finished one. I think that's one way to overcome that. That after you're done with the film, forget about it quickly and move on to the next one. And think about the next one. That's what I try to do.
Well, thank you so much for that insight. We have another audience question, asking, has the Korean film audience changed over the last decades? The audience remembers when Sokyeonje was first opened in Korea, and it was a huge hit. That was nearly 30 years ago. But what are your observations on the changes in the more popular stories to be told in Korea and for the international audience?
글쎄요, 이제 가장 큰 차이는 한국에서의 어떤 상영관의 변화 같아요. 그 전에 제가
I
처음에
think there's a big difference in the theater. So in the past, in my early days, there weren't that many screens. And so there was one main theater, and that theater would take up 30 to 40% of the entire box office results. But now the environment for theaters are that we have a lot of multiplex theaters. So that has changed. And the sound systems are also very important in watching a film. So blockbusters with huge budgets are what the audience enjoys more. So before, of course, everyone watched films for entertainment. Most people did, but now it's even more so. Purely entertainment. As a creator, I think it's necessary for us to have both. And of course, that makes us ask, what kind of films should we make?
Well, thank you for that. I guess that leads to the next question is kind of what kind of films do you think the market will in Korea will take? Because obviously in the United States and in other places, the OTT platforms and the mobile world and the social media world that we live in really has changed, at least in the United States, changed the types of films that are being released in movies and created really expanded the genre in OTT platforms, whether it's HBO Max or Netflix or whatever have you. And in Korea, are you seeing the same kinds of effects? So that only certain types of films, as you mentioned before, romantic comedies are not so much a big film thing anymore because they're more on television. Is that being felt in other ways as well?
지금 전 세계가 마찬가지겠지만은
I think it's the same around the world because of COVID-19. The way that people watch movies has become quite different now. So rather than going to a movie theater to watch a film, people can watch movies at home alone. So that's the environment that we have now. So that concerns me a bit as a filmmaker. Maybe films are things that only a small number of filmmakers can do, because most will go to Netflix. Maybe those kinds of films on those kinds of platforms will become more mainstream. That's depressing for me a little bit. So first, when we went from film to digital, it's similar to that. Now we're at a stage where change is starting to happen, and it's happening very rapidly. So as a filmmaker, so whether it's the movie theater or whether it's OTT, a director should just focus on making films rather than think about the medium. that's what I'm trying to do.
I think those are incredibly wise words. So a few more questions from the audience. The audience member says you're famous not only for directing your films, but also for writing the screenplays. How do you stay organized and prioritize your tasks, given the dual roles that you have to do as a screenwriter and a director?
I can't really concentrate that well. I think this is really important. The time that I spend focusing, this is what I was thinking, like working on a script for a year and working on a script for a week, sometimes you get the same result. So for a creator, concentration, being able to concentrate is very important. And so that time is going to be quite short. So for a creator, there's laziness and it's very difficult to focus. So even now, I think that's something that all creators think about. They're all fighting to not be lazy.
Well, I think making a film is probably one of the most complicated and difficult undertakings that I can imagine. So I would imagine that you're being very humble and that laziness is probably not a factor in your life. So, so we have a couple more questions from the audience. One is, has there really been support from the government, from the Korean government, for the film industry, and how has this kind of support towards international reaching out been important, to Korean filmmakers, and for Korean filmmakers to be able to make films and to have their voices be heard not only in Korea but outside of Korea?
그 정부의 어떤 지원에 대해서는 제가
Support from the government isn't something that I can identify with. But I would say, I think something that the government did do well is to create the Korean Academy of Film Arts. So graduates of that school, there are lots of directors who graduated from that school, and that changed the tide for Korean cinema. And I think that was the biggest influence.
So we have a final question, I think, from the audience, which I think wraps up the evening quite nicely. So, they say, the audience member says, last year marks the 100th anniversary of Korean films. There's two parts to this question. What do you think of the outlook for the Korean film industry? And the second part of the question is, what do you think should be considered important in the development of Korean films? So maybe we can start with the second one first. Is, what do you think should be considered important in the development of Korean films?
아까도 말씀드렸지만
I mentioned this earlier. So after COVID-19, in a changed environment for consuming movies, how are we going to adjust to that? So that's a concern. But like I said, filmmakers have to make films, whether it's shown in a theater or not, or whether it's shown through OTT, it is going to be made. And I believe that films will continue to be made.
항상 그 발전에 있어 중요한 건 다양성인 것 같아요.
I think diversity is key. Because in terms of creativity and also commercial success, you can't anticipate success and then make something to get that result. I don't think that's possible. So we need diversity and new things. We need films that are diverse, that are new, and they should continue to be made, and new directors should keep coming out. And that's how films will develop.
Wonderful. So from your words, I would think that you think that the outlook for the Korean industry is bright, and that I think Hollywood and other places in the world really look to Korea as a hotbed of creativity. But but just on your closing thoughts, kind of just what your the outlook. What if you had a crystal ball, what is your outlook, do you think, for the Korean film industry?
이렇게 저도 이렇게 뭐랄까요? 이렇게 인터넷이라고 그러나 이렇게 영상으로 이렇게 인터뷰를 한두 번 해봤는데 굉장히
I've done a couple of interviews online like this, video interviews, and it was difficult, but today it was very comfortable. You made me feel right at home. So thank you for that.
예, 한국 영화가
So Korean films and people who love Korean culture, that always surprises me. And I'm very proud.
이야기를 더 만들어야 되지 않을까라는 부담도 되고.
And it's kind of like pressure for me to make good material and tell good stories. And I think Korean filmmakers will continue to make diverse stories, and they're working on that now as we speak. So I'm rambling a little bit. So I believe the interpreter made me sound really good.
Well, Director Jin Ho, Joan and I wanted to thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy day to speak with us and speak to our audience. We very much enjoyed your movie Forbidden Dream from our audiences at Asia Society at the Movies, and we look forward to speaking to you again in the near future.